Hey, welcome to Hear God's Word. This is Michael Loinger. In this podcast, we study and dissect the Bible to better understand what it means and is trying to say. We'll cover theology and dig into the original meaning through language and word studies. We'll even discuss scientific and historical ties, but we'll always come back to the basics. There's so many layers to the Bible, and it's all important. So, if you want to hear what God has to say, then let's dive in. All right. So, we have been talking about Abram's life, and in chapter 12 and 13, we were able to break down some stories, and we had the beginning of Abram's journey out of the land of Haran and down into the land of Canaan where he moves to. Then we had that side story where he goes down to Egypt, gets in a little bit of trouble, goes back to Canaan, but then we actually knocked out a whole chapter on God specifically giving him the land that he was promising him beforehand, and Abram starts to lock in, and we last left off at him settling and pitching his tent and even building another altar to the Lord in Hebron. And Hebron is a little more in the southern, mid-eastern portion of Israel. And the reason why I wanted to walk through those steps again is because we had the story talking about how him and Lot were looking out and they saw this area across from Zoar. And Zoar is most definitely located just a little bit south of the Dead Sea and the plain of the Jordan. But there's actually some information which I can actually go into a little more detail in another book of the Bible, Joshua chapter 3:16. We actually find out a little bit more information specifically about this area, and it kind of helps give us a picture of what's going on. So there's two options. Either when they were up still in that Bethel Ai region, they would have been north of the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea, and they would have been looking to the northern part by the Jordan River and the plains over there, which there's times like in Joshua 3:16 where it talks about the river being cut off during certain times, so that would have left open a plain. And so this makes sense. It could have been the area that Lot could have been looking at. And even though Zoar is almost always located in the south, as recognized by most people, it's possible that there could have been a city named Zoar up north that he could have been looking at and towards. However, it's also possible that he could have been in Hebron looking straight across, which could have meant he could have seen Zoar from across the distance in the southern plains, because Hebron is to the south of the Dead Sea. So not exactly sure what the context of the starting point is relating to this, but this area, as we were mentioning, and this name Zoar is going to come into play in this very next part we're going to be starting in chapter 14. And so now we're building more of a world map, especially with the genealogies. And we've been going over some of the people that are settling in areas and some of the nations and the people groups which form the nations or city states and whatever else. And so we're actually going to start getting into something that most people, I don't think, really look much into, but is a really important piece of history during and around the time of Abram and surrounding times a little before and after, but especially the time frame of Abram, because it talks about there being these nations, and we're going to read about how they're at war with each other. And I actually proposed that this was the very first full-on world war that ever took place in history. And it's possible that there were other large wars that had been going on before this, but in Genesis 14, we get a picture of these alliances, and kind of like in the world wars, you had the different alliances that made up two different sides, the Allies and the Axis powers. And so here, if we start reading in chapter 14, and we're going to go 1 through 4 for a specific reason, and then we'll pause there. But I want to explain first the importance and why we're going back to just doing a few verses. Why would we read the entirety of chapter 13, but then only go back to reading 4 verses in this chapter? And it's because in chapter 13 and even in chapter 12, we have more of this narrative, and it's telling more of a story, so it's easier of a flow. But there is some really big setups at the beginning of chapter 14 that we need to break down a little bit slower so that we can get a better picture of what was going on during the time of Abram, because it ends up affecting the world he lives in and the events and interactions he has with the people around him. And even we'll find out a story relating to his nephew Lot and how he gets tangled up in all of this. But we'll end up going into more detail about that as the story goes on. However, as I was saying, essentially this is the very first world war, at least that's described in the Bible. And so let's talk about some of the main areas of power at the time. So as far as the known world and the major powers of the time, you basically had Egypt, you had the Canaanites, and you had the Akkadians and Mesopotamians, which included, the Sumerians and the Akkadians, the Assyrians. You also had Aram, and yet we possibly don't have a lot of consolidation of power at this time. And that might actually contribute to whatever this Goyim is that it talks about, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. But you also have other powers like Elam, which is the southern Persian, which we'll talk about also in a little bit. But after a little while, you also have what ends up becoming the Medes. And then if you go down south, you have the Arabian Peninsula and all the Arab tribes. And then you have basically everything else which doesn't really get mentioned if you scatter and go west into Europe or north into Europe. And obviously, we don't really have any records, at least in the Bible, of stuff when you go further east into Asia, like India or anything in East Asia. However, we have a little bit of, probably African tribes that are also starting to form at that time. And so this is essentially the world powers of the time, but especially when we're talking about the Bible and the story of it, the powers that are most essential to the story of the Bible are these Middle East powers. And if you think about it, they're still some of the world powers today, even though a lot of times we think of first world countries like America, China, Russia, and all of the European Union. At the same time, Israel and the rest of Middle East and the Arab nations are a huge part of the world powers of even modern day. And so they were even bigger at that time. And it was kind of the hub of the world, you could say, especially that Babylon area. So that's where it seems that most of life sprung up from. Things, especially at the Tower of Babel, had spread out from there. And so even though we have the Garden of Eden story, we don't know exactly where that was, but it probably was even located in Mesopotamia, if not somewhere in between there and Africa, where everything started. So it's a pretty important area for us to hone in on, and that's where the story of the Bible focuses. And there was a lot of moving parts, and it's really hard to keep track of all the changes and interactions of these different groups as they were morphing through time. However, we just talked about Egypt, but we're going to set Egypt aside right now, and we're just going to talk about the people of Canaan, and specifically the people of the Valley of Siddim, which is essentially, if you translate that, just means Valley of the Field, which it says basically is the Salt Sea, which is what we know as the Dead Sea. So it goes back to the people actually that Lot was camping and settling with, the people of the valley of that Jordan region. So there's this huge sea that basically separates Canaan from, I guess you could say, like Israel and the more eastern Canaan tribes, which, like we talked about, for example, are people like Sodom, Gomorrah, and that place, Zoar, that we were talking about. And we'll see these names come up again in just a minute. So now let's jump into chapter 14. It says, "At the time when Amraphel was king of Shinar, Arioch king of Elasar, Kedalamer king of Elam, and Tidal king of Goyim. These kings went to war against Berah king of Sodom, Bershah king of Gomorrah, Shinab king of Admah, Shemaber king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these latter kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Dead Sea Valley. For 12 years they had been subject to Kedalamer, but in the 13th year they rebelled." So in this passage we have a list of 4 kings and 5 kings, and it says that these kings went to war, it says in verse 2, and that's why I describe this as the setup of the First World War, at least in the Bible, because we have all of these forces, and you can see in verse 3 when it says they joined forces, essentially it means that they ended up joining, attaching, banding, or binding themselves together, essentially in an alliance. And it's very clear, especially as you continue to read on, that they essentially had network and partnership between these city-states, and they were kind of merged under a banner, like the city-states that were in the valley of the Dead Sea. All of these nations or people groups or cities were merged under the alliance of those who were in that area. And then we have like that Babylon, Mesopotamia sort of area with some of the biggest world powers at the time, such, like I was saying, as Babylon, Assyria, Samaria, Elam, which was actually much bigger than most people who read scripture ever realize, especially back at that time. It was such a big world power that if you look at verse 4, the king Kedorlaomer, he was actually not the ruler of Babylon or Shinar, as it's called, or Arcadia. You know, there's so many different names, as I've mentioned before, with all the name morphing, and especially over time, and different names from different groups of people. But we have actually the king of Elam, who is the one who all of the city nations that are part of that valley of the Jordan or the Dead Sea, they're all servants or subjects or slaves under the king of Elam. And so the king of Elam, of course, is partnered with the other kings from, as we were mentioning, Shinar, Elasar, and Goyim. But let's talk about these places because we've heard about Shinar. Shinar is Babylon. It can be both Akkadia and or Sumeria. So it's that Babylon region, but mainly the middle and upper part, because as we get down to the Elisar, we'll talk about that in a minute, but that's the more southern part. At least most researchers believe essentially the Samaria region of Babylon. And then when we get into Tidal, King of Goyim, that's going to be even more wild because it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly what that's talking about. So let's focus in on this League of Four. And as I was mentioning, essentially these first four kings are the world power dominators of their time. And you'll see that they're the ones who are subjecting the others in the Canaan region. And you can see that as you go into 4, and especially how the League of the 5 different city-states or nations along that Jordan Plains, Dead Sea Valley region, they end up rebelling. And it's against King Kedorlaomer, and that's the one from Elam. And so Elam, as we were mentioning, is a huge world power. But if we focus in again, let's take this just a few words at a time. We have it starting out in verse 1 saying, at the time of Amraphel. So who was Amraphel? We have kind of hinted at it, especially when talking about the genealogies in the past. But essentially, if you look at that name, a lot of people have suggested, and you might be able to see a little bit of the similarity, that many people believe Amraphel was actually Hammurabi. And if you add an H at the beginning and kind of morph the ending of the word, it is somewhat similar to Amraphel, or if you morph them, Amrapi. So a lot of times in these Akkadian Semitic regions, they had their own Akkadian and Semitic branches of the same sort of language. They used a lot of the same shared vocabulary, but every different state or nation would have their own rules of how they would have endings of words. And so a lot of people do suggest, since it matches up close to the time near Abraham where Hammurabi would have lived. However, some people suggest that there was about a 100 to 200 year gap, which is not 100% provable. There's a lot of difficulties when doing calculations, and honestly, it's such a mess when putting together historical timelines. However, whether or not this was Hammurabi, some people even suggest a earlier person, which could have been either Nimrod or even the grandson of Nimrod, which was a guy named Nanias. And even other people have suggested Gilgamesh from the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so who was Amraphel? Well, it's clear that he was the king of Shinar, or in other words, Babylon. And so he was a major power, and we know that Hammurabi was a king of Babylon during this general time frame that Amraphel, as is named in the Bible, was in power. And so that's why a lot of people say that he's the best candidate for who Amraphel was. And the only reason I'm bringing up Hammurabi is just because that's the Babylonian name for what could have been Amraphel. And many people know Hammurabi by the code and laws that he wrote, and he was essentially a pioneer when it came to writing civil and moral and legal codes of conduct for the nation and the people. And so not only that, but he was also a powerhouse when it came to war. And here, what do we know? Him and 3 other kings were in league in warring against the Western tribes and nations and people groups. And we'll see that as we continue going down, but we can at least see that they were in a specific battle against those in the Valley of the Dead Sea. So we got the first king. So it's Amraphel of Shinar. Then next we have Arioch, king of Elasar. And this one is interesting because, as I was mentioning, this was most likely the southern portion of, I guess you could say, the Shinar region, which also could be termed as Sumeria. And the thing about this place, Elasar, is most people identify it with Larsa, which was a pretty big power capital of the Mesopotamia, Babylon region, and it was located in Sumeria, so it was founded during that region. And obviously things have changed since the beginning time of Nimrod establishing all of these what later become powerhouses such as Babylon and Assyria, but they haven't specifically grown into being called those names as a whole. They haven't consolidated yet. So we have these city-states, and a lot of times, as, for example, the Chaldeans who were located in Ur, which was located in Shinar, we have them, which is also in Sumeria, this people group within a specific area. And so they themselves could have been maybe even governing themselves. So we have this king who's in charge of, at minimum, the area of and around Larsa, or as known in the Bible as Elasar. We have this king named Arioch, and we have in other sort of writings like the Sumerian sort of Akkadian writings, a king that was actually a contemporary of Hammurabi named Arioch. So Arioch and Hammurabi, it makes sense since they were living at the same time and were both rulers in that region of Shinar, Samaria, Akkadia. We have both of these rulers. And so I think it's a little bit hard for us to sometimes wrap our mind around the concept of these tribes and these people groups forming nations and having a little bit of ambiguity. But if you think about it, just think of history before all of the big world powers came into play. Just think about how there were tribes all over the place and they were essentially warring for territory. Just think about the Native Americans who lived in America before the Europeans came over. You had different groups occupying different regions, but their territories were always shifting, and this was the area and the land of these people. But you had this king or tribe chief who was in charge. But then, you could also have a subgroup of that tribe with another leader that is breaking off, and you have them just, to the north or south, and they are, either allied or in league, or maybe even fighting against that group that's right next to them. So if you think about things in this sort of sense, we've been going over these concepts for quite a while, ever since we started talking about genealogies. But now, essentially, we could say we have Amraphel, the one in charge of probably the biggest or most prominent of territories at the time, or maybe Hammurabi, as otherwise known. And then we have Arioch, which could have been Ariuk, who would have been in Sumeria if it was still called that at the time, if not absorbed as a city-state of Shinar by that point. Then we have the next king, which he's someone to really pay attention to. We have the king Kedorlaomer, and he's the king of Elam. And Elam is essentially a little bit east of Samaria and Babylon, and it's in that slightly southeast portion of what is considered the Babylon region or Shinar. And so Elam, believe it or not, as we've been talking about, was a pretty big world power at the time. And Kedorlaomer was obviously a huge force to be reckoned with because, as we also mentioned, he was over and the master or the conqueror probably of those western areas, or we could say the eastern parts of Canaan, because it seems as if they haven't really pushed past the Dead Sea, at least at this moment. That seems to be a place that Canaan is still with the Canaan tribes mainly in control of. So Babylon and Shinar haven't really pushed past the Dead Sea, at least for the most part at this point. It's still in control of by the Canaan tribes, such as the Philistines, and we'd already been over at least a couple other ones. We did specifically in the last chapter mention the Perizzites, which were one of the groups of Canaanites. So if we get back to Elam, one thing that is interesting is the Vulgate, which is the Latin version of the Bible, actually translates Elam as Persia. So Elam is not exactly equated with Persia. However, in one sense, it did dissolve, at least partially, into what we know as Persia, because Persia, is that more eastern part, east of Babylon and Assyria and all these nations. And we also have the Medes over there. And so this Mede-Persian Empire is kind of what we can think of when we think of Elam, and we know that Persia has always been, and even to this day, has essentially dissolved into what we know as Iran today. And so it's not obviously one for one what it was before. In fact, it's way different. But even today, the early beginnings of power of Elam have transferred and in a way wound themselves even to the powerhouse that Iran is to this very day. And some of that culture of the Elam people trickled into the Persian culture, and the Persian culture even has relevance in Iran to this day. So, just some interesting facts there. But also, Elam was also conquered by Assyria and Babylon at one point in time. So, Elam eventually fizzled out and had been back and forth in power throughout the centuries. But just think at this point that they were at the height of their power. And it seems as if they are the main ones pushing and kind of stepping across their ally in Shinar and also Elisar. And they're basically just moving forces through neutral territory to get to those more western parts of what's considered the Near East. And so they're conquering and working on warring against the lands that are to their west, that are just a step over and past the border of Shinar. And so hopefully you guys are able to visualize this. And I know I've mentioned before, but if you haven't spent time, please spend at least a little bit of time looking up maps and enjoying learning about some of the geography that played into this time period, because it's actually really interesting. And if you do look at it, it will start to help you understand the layout of the story of the Bible better. And I know that it's been a huge game changer in me understanding and identifying people groups and places and having those, oh, wow, sort of moments like, okay, this place was known for this. Now that it's being brought up again here in the future, I understand the relevance because, Abram crossed, in through Shechem before. And so Abram actually started out in Ur, which is in Shinar, which is in the land of the Sumerians, which is also the land of the Chaldeans. And the Chaldeans pop up later, and there's this spiritual cult significance in the past. And wow, like God told him to get away from that land. Like there's so much spiritual nuance that we can take away from the story once we dig into some of just these important names both places and like we're talking about kings. Getting back to this king of Elam, Kedalamer, we actually have some historical records of there being a king in Elam by the name of Kuter Lagamar or Lagamru. So there we have an interesting correlation with what could have been King Kedorlamar. And so now we have 3 kings in league. We have essentially Acadia or Shinar with Amraphel. We have Elisar, which was southern city-state in Samaria or Babylon with Arioch as the ruler. And then we have what's, at least at this moment, the biggest threat and world power of the Near East at the time, Kedorlaomer of Elam. And that's the modern day Persia, at least the southern portion. So now we come to the last and fourth ally in the Eastern Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian region of the world. And we have King Tidal, who's the king of Goyim. And so there's a lot of theories with this one, and it's really hard to pin down because, first of all, we have no idea who Tidal was. And number 2, it's hard to know whether or not Goyim, which if you break the word down, go means people and im is the plural. So basically the people or the nations is one way it could be translated. So King Tidal of the nations. And so the question is, was he the king over just a vast territory and group in the Assyria and Babylon region, especially when you go more north and a little bit west of Babylon? Is he the one who's essentially the governor of a huge, vast area of this territory? And the answer is, I don't know. So one interesting thing that can lead us down some rabbit trails, we could go down a few, and one of them is talking about who Tidal was. And there's only one thing that I could find, which when you look at Tidal in Assyrian, you get Turgal, and it means great son, especially when in the Septuagint, which is the Greek version. And so his name meaning great son, especially if we go back to, what does Goyim mean? It's probably not Babylon or Elam or like the Akkadian or Samaria area, because we already got the kings of those areas. So could it be referring to like a great son or king of that Assyria, Aram, and other sort of area? And that would have been a very vast and great area. And we know that even back then, Assyria and Aram were growing in power. And we know that Nimrod had established the area of Ashur, which is what we know as Assyria. And there is an interesting connection. I saw in one place the name Ashur Ubalits related to potentially this great sun at the time. And isn't it interesting that the name of the territory is Ashur? And so could Goyim be basically the nations of Ashur and Aram? Is it possible that, they're not quite as settled and there are many peoples scattered but still collected under one great ruler and under, potentially this Targal guy or Tidal as mentioned in the Bible? And could it have been either Ashur Ubalid, as I mentioned, or possibly a ruler that came after Ashur? I think that it's highly possible that it's encompassing this sort of region, that Syria region. And a lot of things that I've looked up have also suggested that there are a lot of nomadic tribes that would have consisted maybe of these Goyim or the nations, and basically the peoples of that region of the world that didn't have a specific nation. Or it's possible that Goyim could have been referring to what was Ashur and possibly even a little bit connecting with Aram as well. So those are some of the theories, but there's another one, which is that Goyim is actually a specific place, and some have suggested that it's actually a form of what became known as the Galilee region. So it's up more north, and it's maybe more of that Aram and Phoenician culture, and the Jordan essentially would have been what's known as Aram territory. And so is it possible that it was just a bunch of, as mentioned earlier, nomadic tribes that formed this area, just referred to either as, the Goyim or the nations, or that actually was the name of a specific group of people, maybe more consolidated in that Galilee sort of region, and it would have been a little above the Jordan Valley, so you wouldn't have had them necessarily mingling with those who were in the Dead Sea Valley area and the Jordan. They would have been just up to the north of that. So that's another speculation that people have. And so how exactly can we know and understand? Obviously, as I like to say, I don't know. But at least now we can picture that we are essentially wrapping ourselves around a very large area of the Dead Sea, from that Aram area all the way down through and into a little bit of even the Arabia area. The people of the Valley of the Dead Sea are kind of surrounded by these major world powers, and they are a huge threat. And so, like we've mentioned, they're servants, and that probably means they're paying tribute and have been conquered in the past already, which is why we're going to hint at some other stuff in the next areas, because it says they rebel. So since there's pushback, obviously it's going to create more tension and war. And it's not like war hasn't already been going on in this area, because the King of Elam has obviously already done some war and subjugating. So with that, let's talk about the next group. So we have this league and alliance of 4. Again, to name it off, it's Shinar, Elisar, Elam, and Goyim. Then we have a couple names you might know: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, or as we've mentioned before, another name for Bela is Zoar. So let's break these ones down now. And so Sodom, an interesting thing is most of you guys probably know the story of, unfortunately, let's spoil it, even though we did in the past already, gets destroyed. And so the name Sodom probably comes from the word burnt, because essentially it's turned to ash and completely burnt up and destroyed. And so then we have the king of the city-state of Sodom. And so it's a pretty big city and power of the time in the Canaan and Jordan Valley region, probably the biggest and most prominent of the cities. And so we have King Barah in Sodom. Then we go down south a little bit, approximately 5 to 10 miles, and we have Gomorrah. And we have over there a king named Birsha. And an interesting thing about the city Gomorrah is it probably was named that because of its culture and habitation. So it seemed like it was a very inhabitable and cultured place to live, both, I'm guessing, economically, because of not only the culture of the people being lively, and there probably being a lot of merchants coming into the town, but also the cultivating and fertility of the land and the crops there. So it obviously was a really nice hub at the time for them to be able to build and locate a city there. And it was built right off of the Dead Sea, so they would have had access to some really fertile land. And a thing about the name Birsha, King Birsha, is if you translate his name literally, it essentially means son of evil. And what do we know about Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, we already saw in chapter 13 how it says in verse 13, "Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord." But once we get further on, we see that Sodom and Gomorrah end up going pretty close to hand in hand, even though Sodom is separated and is not the same exact city, which I always thought growing up that the name of the city was literally called Sodom and Gomorrah, but they are, as I mentioned, a little bit distanced apart from each other. So you'd actually have to travel from one to the other, and you'd have to go a few miles. However, they were located pretty close, and it seems as if the culture was pretty close to the same. The climate of their spiritual condition was pretty wicked and evil. And I think it's possible that that's how the king from Gomorrah got his Hebrew name, at least, of Beersheba. Then we have the third of the 5 kings, and we have in the city of Admah, we have King Shinab, and there's not really much I could find on him, but essentially it's located in between the next 2 cities that we'll talk about. So it's, if you go even more down south, so then if you go to the next nation or city state or people group, you have Zeboim, or the people of Zebo, and you have King Shemaba, and there's not really much that I could find on Zeboim except for the fact that it's the furthest south, at least that's what most people predict. It's even below what we were talking about with Admah. So that leaves the last one, which is the king of Bela, or otherwise known as Zoar. So Zoar is right at the bottom of the Dead Sea. You go just a little bit south. That's where it's predicted that Zoar was. I know we talked about at the beginning that there's the smallest chance it could actually be up north above, but almost everyone suggests that it was down below, and it makes sense because of locating it near these other cities that are to the south of the Dead Sea, and they're located in this area, which is iconic, which will come up actually later in the story. And so to the south of the Dead Sea, you have essentially these, what is considered very mineral rich land, but also, unfortunately, many tar pits because of what exactly is going on with that land. It's a very both nice but dangerous region at the same time, and it gets even worse after the disaster of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so with that said, we'll get more into that story, but also there probably was, and it's even maybe hinted at later on in scripture, that there was some of the Jordan River coming down, but it got blocked up and dried up at some point earlier on in history. And that's why there were these tar pits that ended up forming down there, and it ends up playing into the story because stuff obviously starts to happen in that region below. And so these cities are located near these flats and fields and tar pits that are scattered throughout the southern Dead Sea Valley, as we could say. So we got Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, which is renamed later on Zoar, as these southern Dead Sea Valley cities. And that's 3. And if you add Sodom and Gomorrah into the mix, that's 5. And so you have the Dead Sea Valley Alliance. So at least that's what I'm calling it. So you have them versus the superpowers of the East, which is essentially that Akkadia, Semitic, Babylon, Elam, Persian, Assyrian culture. And like we talked about, now we get into what ends up happening in the story. So we've established the two groups of allies. We have the Death Valley, and then we have the Akkadian alliances. And what it says about it is all of the latter kings, which is all of the 5 from the Death Valley alliance, they were joined in forces in the Valley of the Dead Sea. So that's where I am making the assertion. It's pretty clear there. But then we get to the very crux and end of at least the beginning of introducing this story of what I call the very first, or the Near East World War. And so it says for 12 years, which they is the alliance of the Dead Sea Valley, all those 5 cities or nations or tribes were all subject to Kedorlaomer. So they all were servants or slaves or subjects of Elam, basically. And so when it says they were servants, basically it probably means that they were conquered at one point and they're paying tribute and paying taxes to Elam. And they were doing that for 12 years. It says they were servants, and maybe they were even working for, because the word it uses there is essentially workers. So they were workers or laborers or servants or slaves of Elam, and they were doing it for 12 years. But they finally had enough. In the 13th year, they rebelled. And so now things are obviously going to get heated. They probably stopped working for them, stopped paying their taxes. And obviously, the Akkadian and the Elamite, the people of Elam powers, were not happy about it. So they're going to push back again, whereas they probably had before and won. The Dead Sea Valley Alliance is not having it. They're pretty sick of the subjugation and probably the condition that it's leaving their people in. They're using a lot of their resources to fund these superpowers to the east. They're probably losing economically because of this. And so even if things hadn't got that bad, they decided to push back and rebel. In whatever way they did, they either started fighting or warring or stopped paying their taxes or sent a petition to say, hey, can we be free? I don't know what method they used, but the term that it says there is that they rebelled. So now I wanted to pivot gears and tie some of the concepts together and link us to why everything that's come before his and can help contribute to helping us understand better the story that's going on here. So we have Elam, which Elam is, if you look back at the genealogy in chapter 10, actually a son of which son? Shem. And if you go even back another chapter and you go into that story about Noah and how he blessed and cursed his 3 sons, you have Shem, who is praised, and he actually says that Canaan is going to be a slave of Shem. And what did we just say? Elam is a son of Shem. So basically, the people of the Canaan Valley are essentially Canaanites. And they're obviously the Western Canaanites. But it's super interesting that essentially they're servants, just as Noah already prophesied and gave a blessing and curse for his children. It's actually already coming true and being fulfilled. And this is the crazy thing about prophecy, is God uses Abraham to start predicting and telling the future story of the people and the world as it's going to be. And prophecy in the Bible is so much more than a prediction of the future. It's more so a description of the current circumstances and how that's going to evolve in the future of the world and God's plans. And for example, when God would tell some of the future prophets to warn people, when they didn't listen, what ended up happening is destruction, just as God said it would. And so it's not necessarily only predicting the future and saying, oh, I'm predicting that you're going to be destroyed because you're not following God. It was more so, hey, here's the warning. And because you are ignoring it, you're on the track of destruction. So that's what's going to happen to you, because it's very clear by looking at your past, you're not going to listen. So this is going to be your outcome. And so this is the power of prophecy. If you go back, because Canaan was on the path and track of dishonorable things, so will his descendants be. And here it is, it's playing out. Canaan's descendants are committing horrible, evil atrocities, as mentioned in chapter 13. It's said that they're doing evil in God's eyes. And it's really, really sad. But so on point, the prophecies that are already starting to become true. And this is why we pay attention to blessings and curses, because they have power. And especially when they're inspired by God, it creates a powerful and predictive future for our world. And that's why we pay attention to prophecies in the Bible and we see where they lead. Because here we can see that the Canaanites, the sons of Canaan, who settled in that Dead Sea Valley region, they are servants, just as Noah predicted, to Shem, who the Elamites are sons of Shem. And so that's just really powerful. And to read specifically what it says in Genesis 9, starting in verse 25, it says, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of servants, will he be to his brothers. he also said, "Praise be to Yahweh, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the servant of Shem." There you have it right there. Canaan and the Dead Sea Alliance is servants to Elam, the sons of Shem. And so it's already coming true. And so this is where we end up leaving off with the story. We have the very beginning of a turning point with this war, because the Dead Sea Alliance is just beginning to rebel, and they're trying to avoid whatever kind of servitude and subjection they have to King Kedlomar of Elam. So in the next episode, we'll push more into the story of what happens to these nations and how does it all play into the story of Abram, and why is it just cutting in? It seems like the Bible really loves doing that, and that's going to lead into verse 5 as we go further into the story, seeing how exactly the story of the Near East World War I ends up panning out. Hey, I'm so glad you guys could join for today's podcast. I hope things clicked for you and that you're able to better understand God's word. Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." So keep on listening to what God has to say, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless.